right? The author and the author's assistant.
Exactly. Really?
Yes, really.
That's amazing. That's amazing. So when it comes to maritime history, pretty much in general, but specifically here on the San Mateo coast, these girls are just it. They know more than anybody. They have actually written all of the books, as you can see here. So obviously this seemed like a really good location to discuss maritime history on the coast side for obvious reasons. Hopefully everyone started to warm up a bit. So without further ado, JoAnn.
But I can't begin to tell you how thrilled I am to be here. This is the first class, docent class, for our new Half Moon Bay History Museum, and I get chills even saying that. Thank you. Being part of this historic moment. We've been part of this organization since it began. We've been working on different issues and waiting to see this come to fruition. Next year, Julie and I will definitely be part of the docent corps. We weren't able to participate in the classes this year, but next year we will. So we're looking forward to that in our spare time. We'll do that too. But thank you very much for being here and doing this. I can't think of anything more worthwhile than doing something for our community. And you guys are all contributing to that. So thank you very much. I want to point out before I get started that in my highlights, I probably listed about 5 kind of significant events or milestones. I want to tell you today, I'm going to give you just the highlights of those things because each one of those segments I could easily give a separate presentation on, whether it's shore whalers or rum running or World War II or the landings or the shipwrecks or any of those things. And that's just to tell you that there is so much history here that is maritime related. And so if you're interested, delve into it. That's what got me started. And I'm still learning things. So just understand that I'm going to give you those little bits, and then I'm also going to allow a little time for questions because I really like that part. I always learn something, and there's a good exchange, I think, between people. So we'll do that after I finish. Well, my interest in maritime history happened because I was on my first ship at age 3. And that voyage made such a huge impression on me that I've loved ships and stories of the sea and the sea itself ever since. And all the events that I'm going to talk to you about today are about what I've learned, stories I've learned about the history, the maritime history of Half Moon Bay and Point Montera. And all the events stretched between this 5-mile coast between both Point Montera or Montera and Half Moon Bay. And it's along what author John Steinbeck called the Hard Luck Coast. There were so many events, so many shipwrecks that we actually named that stretch of coast the Hard Luck Coast. Now our voyage begins with the California Gold Rush. Far more immigrants came by sea than overland, seeking their fortunes as miners and merchants. And many people don't realize that the gold rush was essentially a maritime event. So that's also something to think about. Now, ships of all types journeyed from the East Coast ports to San Francisco, braving treacherous Cape Horn at the tip of South America. That trip was over 15,000 miles. They carried coffee and coal, fish and flour, livestock and lumber, mahogany and molasses, pianos and people, rice and railroad iron, sardines and soap, timber and tea, and much more. Do you see that I love alliteration? It's all true. These are all cargoes, and the cargoes, usually people, it's when you talk about cargoes or cargo ships, it's not boring. It runs the gamut. And of course, when there were shipwrecks, scavengers took advantage of that. Well, this increased activity also created new maritime opportunities for many coastside entrepreneurs. One of them was James G. Denniston, and his ranch was centered near what is now Princeton by the Sea. In 1858, Denniston built the coastside's first wharf, and it's set just north of Half Moon Bay on the southeast side of what's Pillar Point Harbor. Denniston loaded his own goods, but he also let local farmers and merchants load goods from there as well. The The area became known as Denniston's Landing, or more often, Potato Wharf, because of the large number of spuds that were loaded onto ships. And most of the ships were bound, of course, for San Francisco. Many small schooners came into that little port, and one of them was the 45-ton Black Warrior. It was a frequent visitor to the landing, and on one occasion, the ship's keel was damaged while lying at anchor due to a small earthquake. This was in September of 1859, so an unusual little event. Denniston's Landing also sat on a shore whaling station. One report said, another huge whale came ashore on the ranch of James Denniston, making the third which has come ashore in the last 8 months. This is larger than the others. It is a humpback and measures 65 feet in length. It is estimated it will yield 40 barrels of oil. And this became a very lucrative business too. Many, as you'll see, many people made very good livings because those huge whales were so large and so much oil could be extracted. The station was established in 1861 and moved to Pigeon Point, a neighbor, in 1862, but another one appeared in 1871. It was known as Half Moon Bay Whaling Company, and it operated in a cove called Whaleman's Harbor. Like most others, the whaling company consisted of one captain, a mate, a cooper, and that's someone who creates wooden barrels and casks, 2 boat steermen, and 11 other crew. Leadership was provided by Captain Frank White. Now, White was born Francisco Alves de Silveira in the Azores, and as was the custom of many Portuguese whalemen, he adopted an American name. But after the season, the whaling season of 1882, he quit the business to become a farmer, and that wasn't unusual. Most of the time, the shore whalers were actually, it was seasonal. They split their year into the whaling season, and then most of the rest of the time they were farmers. That was the normal occupation. They may have done other things, but that was fairly typical. And then when they finished their careers in shore whaling, they would go on and create their own farms and ranches. But with his retirement came the end of the whaling company here in Half Moon Bay. By that time, there were 2 other landings for shipping operations in this area. One was created in 1860 by James Van Carnap, and he installed a hawser system at Miramontes Point, just south of Half Moon Bay. The 55-ton schooner Black Prince and the 116-ton schooner Wild Pigeon often loaded grain there. One report said the vessels approached the shore where a post supporting a loading device could sling cargo onto the schooners. And you can see by the wires here, it was known as loading by wire. And you can see that it comes right on down to the deck, and oftentimes, it's not so true in this case because they're loading materials, but they would also attach a hawser to the mast itself and send the material onto the ship. Now in 1868, Josiah P. Ames also established a very successful landing here. It was actually the most successful one here in this area. And it was located near present-day Miramar. The pier extended about 500 feet into the water, and then the next year, Ames added another 1,000 feet, so he could accommodate larger vessels. A track extended down the center of a large warehouse to the pier, and this allowed horse-drawn flat cars to carry grain and other goods to the warehouse, from the warehouse to the ship at the end of the wharf. Now, this process was very efficient, but on occasion it was very dangerous. Once, the heavily loaded flat car broke through the pier, so the cargo, the car, the horse, the driver all plunged into the water. Now, sadly, the horse was killed, but the driver escaped with his life. Meanwhile, many other ships were out along the coast, and many did not reach their final destination. The first recorded shipwreck in Half Moon Bay happened in 1856. Known as a very fast bark with clipper lines, the Isabelita Hine was part of the China trade, and she traveled what was then called the Silk Road of the East. She was traveling from San Francisco to Hong Kong during that period, connecting the Far East with the Western world. The sleek little ship carried exotic goods such as silk, ivory, porcelain, gold, and jade, but it was tea that remained the heart of the trade. Now, recognizing the commercial opportunities, her owner, Gideon Nye, moved his operations from Canton to Baltimore, or from Baltimore to Canton, I'm sorry. He wrote, "The very name of China suggested the romance of history and created imaginative dreams." Unfortunately, Nye's dreams were shattered in 1856 when his most profitable ship, the Isabel Liane, wrecked near HMV. Rumors swirled around the wreck. One report declared there was a mutiny. The captain and first mate were murdered, and the crew intentionally wrecked the ship to conceal evidence of their crime. Ultimately, it was determined that the captain had been weakened by illness, and the greedy first mate drowned by the weight of his money belt. In the 1860s, America was in the throes of a bloody civil war, and President Lincoln ordered a blockade of southern ports. This drastically affected the area's shipment of crucial goods, which included sugar. As a result, the sugar industry was decimated. One report said many fine plantations now lay waste and idle. Well, schooners like the Elfin Knipper carried sugar to America from Peru. And when the ship was wrecked in 1862, Half Moon Bay residents stole most of that sugar. The cargo that was aboard was 337 pounds. So you can just imagine the swarm of people that must have gone to that ship. One newspaper said this: "The sugar was taken to stores in town, but it was dumped out of bags into barrels so it couldn't be identified." And this was a common practice. Wherever there was a shipwreck, local residents would go down to the wreck, gather up whatever the cargo was. It could be sugar, coal, liquor, pianos, I mean, you name it, and they would bring it back into their homes, because living in isolated areas like this, that was a boon to their living style and sometimes to the economy, such as the sugar going into stores. So it's not that they looked for shipwrecks, but it certainly supported people in this area and the economy in this area. But there are also no what I would call wreckers. People often ask that question, like in Florida, where they purposely did something to make wrecks happen. There's no evidence that that happened.
Question.
Oh, yes.
So it's just, I mean, I think I was watching a movie or another show or something, and, you know, yeah, a shipwreck would happen, and everybody goes down, especially in isolated areas. Is that assuming that the crew was gone, was lost at sea, or did they?
I'm sorry, Janice.
The crew, when this pillaging was going on, where was the crew? Were they gone? Were they dead? Were they helping?
Good question. Everybody hear the question? What happened to the crew? Were they gone? Did they drown? Were they helping? And the answer is sometimes all of the above. It depended on the occurrence. Each shipwreck was different. In some cases, yes, there was such a terrible shipwreck that there was no crew left, no captain. On some cases, it might be a few crew members. I remember one story where a sea captain actually took a rope and threw it onto the ship in order to claim ownership of that property, you know, for salvaging purposes. And he hung on to that and even made kind of a temporary little shed to sleep in, he and a couple of crew members, while the actual salvagers, the official salvagers for the company, came from San Francisco. Other times, residents would come down, help the crew, and they would put ropes out and bring them in one by one, or take little dories out if the sea permitted. Sometimes it didn't. Other times, everything was just washed away. So there was quite a litany of things that happened during that time.
Do you have information, or in the stories that you've read and the research you've done, like, would a lot of times those crews join the community that they were in, if they were
Yes.
in a very small area, far from home, transportation's gone, no more ship?
On
never
occasion,
get back
that
to
did
where they
happen,
came from?
absolutely. They may have a short stay here, or they may come back, and that's later in New York. Captain Peabody and his family did that. So some of them did become members of the community. Many of them were continuing to sail, and they were with the company or with the captain, and so they would all be mostly sent to San Francisco and then put aboard another ship or whatever else they might want to do at that time. Others did quit the sea. There was one young man in one of the stories in one of my books where he said it was his first shipwreck. And he said somehow, and he lost some crewmates, and he said somehow, I don't want to go back to sea. One wrecking is enough for me. And so that was a terrible traumatic experience for many, especially the young sailors, and so many of them did not go back to sea, many did.
Thank you.
Another question? Was that an accepted practice when the ship went down for citizens to come and claim for everything?
Yes, the question is, was that an accepted, was that an accepted practice to descend on the ships? Absolutely. In those days, the maritime law was not what it is, though there really wasn't much maritime law in those days. So it was pretty much first come, first serve, whoever could claim it. Sometimes there were a lot of arguments over who was responsible for it in terms of the official salvagers. Other times people would fight over goods, or it was a question of, whoever claimed it first, like that captain I mentioned, by just throwing a rope aboard and standing by and saying, this ship is mine. So there were a variety of things, but it was all an accepted maritime practice. In 1865, the passenger ship Colorado was launched, and it was hailed as a floating palace. It was $1 million side wheel steamer, and she was the largest liner at that time to ever fly the Pacific. The Colorado's inaugural voyage was highly anticipated, and one account said this: flags waved and bands played. The crowd cheered wildly. Salutes were fired from guns on the steamer and on the wharves. She was also the first American liner to carry mail as well as passengers across the Pacific to the Orient. After she foundered in 1868 at Point Montera, she floated free, but the near disaster left its mark on that area. The ledge where she struck became known as Colorado Reef, and that's just right out here. In 1872, the British iron sailing ship Aquilio was lost near Point Montera. The captain and crew made their way to shore and began gathering up bits of cargo strewn along the beach. Some of the goods were Christmas toys, and according to one account, Captain McKay salvaged a china doll and slipped it into the arms of the first little girl he saw. Years later, the wreck was captured on canvas by noted coastal artist Galen Wolfe. He created a series of watercolors called Legends of the Legends of the Coastland, which depicted local historical events. He immortalized the Aquilio in this work called The Toy Ship. And it had very personal meaning for Wolfe, because the little girl that the captain had encountered on the beach was his mother.
The little doll
See,
in the right.
in this here is where he depicts that. And the larger story of that is that she stayed with the family in San Francisco for years and sat at the table, their dining room table, for every birthday and anniversary for decades. The Aquilio's loss also made a lasting impression on others and on local officials. And in 1875, a fog signal began operating at Point Montera.
Right, Maria? Yeah, we're in it.
Right here. And also built were quarters for two keepers and their families.
That's so cool, yeah.
After the wreck of other vessels, the first light was established in 1900. And it was simply a red lantern, and this kind of happened in many places along the coast, placed atop a pole. But then this skeleton tower was built in 1914. In 1928, a cast iron tower was erected and still stands today. But the significance of this tower was only known recently, actually when I was finishing my book about Point Montera and Half Moon Bay. Researchers discovered that it had been moved from Cape Cod, making Point Montera the only lighthouse in America to have stood on both the East Coast and the West Coast. Yes. There's the mess.
Go Point Montero.
So yes, and so this 30-foot tower is a very, it's a very significant little landmark for us. It's not open to the public, but I have to say, because of the work we do, we get to go places. And so we've been up there. And it may look interesting to go into, but most people probably, you know what I'm saying, probably wouldn't want to go in because it's basically up a straight ladder and then up onto kind of this little, not really a catwalk, and that's all there is in there. It's kind of, most people wouldn't want to attempt it, even though it's a small lighthouse. There's, it takes some skill to navigate that thing. Now, Point Montero's beacon was automated in 1970, and the fourth order Fresnel lens, and it is pronounced Fresnel, the lens was built by a French physicist. It's on display at the San Mateo County History Museum, and it's part of a permanent display called Ships of the World, along with artifacts from the wreck of the Rydal Hall and the New York. And as part of the exhibit, I am featured in a video highlighting local maritime history. So if you have an opportunity to go, not just because I'm part of it, I was very fortunate being asked to do that, but to see some of the actual artifacts that were collected and given to the museum. I'm one of those people who loves to touch those things, and in some cases here we'll be talking about that. And it's a really good opportunity for you or for families to go and enjoy local maritime history. And when the cargo ship Rydal Hall crashed at Point Montero in 1876, 10 of the crew perished. Coal and fragments of the ship littered the beach. One man, Chico Gonzalez, gathered up this wooden sea chest, and I had the privilege of meeting his grandson, John Gonzalez Jr., who told me, that old sea chest has been around since I was a little kid. My dad packed it around with him everywhere. Well, as it turned out, that sea chest was a very appropriate memento for his father, John Gonzalez Sr., and he's shown here, because in the 1950s and 1960s, he was keeper here at Point Montero. Now, the Rydal Hall sunken hulk was rediscovered quite by accident in 1971. Divers John Kempf and Roy Lee were poking around the reef looking for abalone. And they found anchors, cannon, and even the ship's bell. And you can see here, John Kempf is here, Roy Lee is here, and I've talked to John about his diving and raising all of this. You can see one of the cannon that's coming out, and down there is the ship's bell. And he said, he told me when I interviewed him, he said, when I spotted a knob sticking out of the pile, I knew it was something special. That bell is priceless. And I asked John the last time I talked to him after the exhibit, which was at San Mateo, that was established in 2014. I talked to John during that period and I said, well, now there's the cannon, a couple other things you raised there, but where's that bell? He said, I still have it. So I've got my eye on him to say, you know, you need to donate that someday. I would love to get it for us, but, you know, we'll see. Built in 1870, the Alice Buck was had an illustrious line of mariners that were her captains. And she sailed until 1881. A new captain was asked to fill in for her regular master, but it would be her final voyage. When she wrecked at Half Moon Bay, reports said, the ship struck with an awful crash on the rocks. She bumped 5 or 6 times, and at last broke in 2. 9 of the crew perished. Like the Aculeo, the Alice Buck stirred Galen Wolfe's interest. This rendering, called simply the Wreck, captures the ship's disastrous end. Now, schooners like the Argonaut, there were several different types of vessels that we're talking about, and not just the famous clipper ships, but and that sort of thing. They're all in here, but we have fishing vessels, we have schooners that are the hardworking trucks of the day, we have all kinds of vessels, and that's something that might be interesting for some of you to look into or explore too. I found at first I was in love with these beautiful clipper ships when I started my research, but then I fell in love with these schooners because they're small, they're fast, they're efficient. They did the hard work of building our coastsides, cities and carrying its produce and lumber and that sort of thing. So that's something that I think each of you might think about is, you know, what is it that stirs me? Is there a ship or a person or an event? And do a little extra research. That's always what I've done, and I kind of really learned a lot. And I'd love to have some of you get a little stimulated and do that too. So again, schooners like the Argonaut were an important part of maritime commerce. They were the trucks of their day, hauling lumber to and from dangerous, what they called dog hole ports, up and down the coast. And dog hole ports were places like Pigeon Point, the harbor, all up and down this place, up and down the coastside, where there wasn't really room for large piers or large wharves. And it was said of these tiny ports that there was hardly enough room for a dog to turn in, to crawl into the port, turn around, and then crawl back out. Because most of the schooners, when they did that, had to anchor that way because of the existing current. So it was very hard and very difficult work. When the Argonaut wrecked in 1881, Keeper David Splain ran to the rescue. He launched a small boat, bringing the captain and the crew safely ashore. A local election was in progress, and the crew plunged eagerly into the celebration, just as if nothing had happened. Captain Lovedale remarked, "I've been shipwrecked 6 times, but never before have I been cast up among so many kind people, so many pretty women, and so much good grub." I'm not sure I would have reacted that way after being shipwrecked, but you know, he was a seasoned, shipmaster. Originally named the TF Oaks, the New York was one of only 3 full-rigged iron sailing ships ever built in this country. It's one of my favorite stories. She was also one of the most notorious vessels to ever sail. She was often written up in the Red Record, which was a column run in the Coast Seaman's Journal highlighting incidents of shipboard brutality. The TF Oaks earned the reputation of a ship on which the blows were plenty and the food was scarce. During one disastrous voyage from Hong Kong in 1896, the ship was caught in several storms. The captain was partially paralyzed by a stroke, and the rest of the crew came down with scurvy. Most of them died. The captain's wife, Hannah Reed, took the helm and sailed the ship safely to port. Described as a sturdy, gray-haired, slate-eyed woman of 50, she was awarded a silver medal for her bravery. The ship was sold and renamed the New York, but that didn't change her bad luck. Carrying a cargo from Hong Kong, again, she wrecked at Half Moon Bay in 1898 and sank into the sand. Fortunately, no lives were lost. Now this photo is basically taken in the New York wrecked, essentially at the foot of what is now Kelly Avenue. So when you're down in that area, many people have gone down there and seen that space, but there's a woman I met that had an artifact in her home, and she has a view right out to the spot where the shipwreck actually happened. Now, years later, the captain's daughter, Claire Peabody, wrote a book about the many passages that she made with her father and also about surviving the wreck of the New York. She said, "From the first day of the voyage, we had a miserable time. We ran into a storm after storm. The disheartened crew whispered among themselves that the New York was a jinxed ship." And also I might say about the New York is that many people that we know in this community have, and many of the families, still have artifacts in their homes from that particular shipwreck. It was so massive, so big, and it was carrying so many interesting things from the Orient. Porcelain dishes, you name it, and people collected those and still keep them in their homes. And they also even hauled off the captain's chair. And so they took everything they possibly could. Florence was built on Scotland's famous River Clyde. For more than 30 years, she weathered storm after storm. And at the helm was Captain William Leask, who he was described this way. It took only a glance at the keen gray eyes peering from beneath bushy eyebrows, the determined set of a square lower jaw, to note a man accustomed to command. In 1899, Captain Leask retired from the sea, sadly after being bashed in the head by a steward who was stealing liquor. He left the deck for the last time and he lamented, "Poor old Florence, it won't be long now." He lived long enough to see his prophecy come true. The following year, the city of Florence met her demise just 200 yards from where the infamous New York had been lost. The USS DeLong was a Navy destroyer named for the famous Arctic explorer, George DeLong. The ship was thrown off course and plowed into the reefs at Point Montera in 1921. Rescue teams arrived, set up a breeches buoy, and brought the crew safely to shore. And what that basically is a pair of rubber pants that is shot out by what's called a small little cannon called a Lyle gun, and they shoot it out to a line out to the ship. And I like this picture because you can see exactly what they're doing. And then they pull that out to the ship, and one by one, people get into that, in this case the crew, and are hauled ashore, one by one. So it's a very kind of arduous piece of work they have to do, but it actually has saved an awful lot of lives. The crew was saved, but the ship was scrapped and used as repair parts for other ships. Now, between 1920 and 1933, Prohibition was in effect, banning all alcohol. Now, needless to say, this was not a very popular law. Many citizens enjoyed a good, stiff drink now and then, even if it was illegal. In 1922, the schooner Grays Harbor ran ashore near Point Montera, but was partially salvaged. It seems she had several brushes with the law. Once the Grays Harbor had 45 quarts of illicit brew confiscated by local officials, and one December, holiday spirits had a setback when 20 cases of whiskey were discovered hidden in the captain's quarters. Now, all this and more happened along this small stretch of coast. I could go on and on and on with stories, but the point is there's so much here that we need to learn and keep learning and share and pass on. And there's one thing I would like for you always to remember, and that is that we are standing in the middle of history. So I ask you, look out to the ocean and give it more than a passing glance. Think about its ships, its stories, and its people, and carry a little bit of history home in your heart. Thank you. I'll take questions and then sign books if anybody's interested. Other questions?
I've got one question. There's an old wooden structure weathering out at the bluff right now, just where I think it's just south of where the Amesport Pier was, just south of the ferry. Rada, do you know if that's part of the old wharf structure?
I don't know.
It's got timbers that are like 12, 14 inch
For a
square.
while, there was a piece, and I've seen pictures of it. There was a piece of the old wharf, but it gradually deteriorated, and I thought that it had all passed away, but I don't know.
You might want to go down there. It's still weathering out. It's being attacked by people, so I don't know how much longer it'll be there.
There was a loading pier built on Tenedas, at the end of Tenedas. Wasn't in your picture, and it sounded like a pretty crazy idea. Didn't last very long.
Gordon Chute, right.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I was just reading something the other day, they send, like you in the picture, the sacks of grain, and it was so steep, the sacks would burn up by the time the grain got down to the ship. The sacks would catch on fire.
That's probably true, because of the friction, too,
Yep.
that took place. And that's a very interesting point, actually, about the various chutes and so on. I actually have seen a list of, that probably, it goes on for pages, and it's one line at a time, where there were hundreds of those kinds of things up and down the coast from one period to another. They were chutes, they were landings, they were, these were the larger ones that were identifiable and that worked, well for a period of time. But lots of those places all along the coast, and they were just to serve a very specific purpose.
I think
They were
some
on
of them,
somebody's land or.
sacks of grain, I think some of them were logs, probably prohibition.
Probably because we often know that happened. There was a story out at Pigeon Point Lighthouse too, and I'm sure it happened here, that Pigeon Point had the loading by wire effort. So what they would do, like I have a video, actually it was an oral history taken by years and years ago, that I happened to come into possession of a woman who was the daughter of one of the assistant lighthouse keepers out there, Jessie Migrants, and her name was Jessie, I-E versus E. And she talked about how they would see them come in on moonlit nights and actually use the derrick, to load off your illegal liquor. And so that happened all along these places because the coves were very accessible, they were dark and isolated, and so it made it easy for them to do their activity, usually without being caught.
When was Romeo's Pier built?
Sorry?
Romeo's Pier?
Mayo's Pier, yes.
When was that built? I mean, is that old or?
That's, let me think. Dave, do you remember?
I couldn't hear the question.
Romeo's Pier?
Which?
When Romeo's Pier, when was that built?
The
It
green?
was
Remember?
built, I think, about 1948, so it's fairly
Yeah, I thought it
new.
was a
And of
late-
course, it's being demoed now.
Yeah.
May
I thought it was a
24th.
I think that's the picture you had leading in, was Romeo's
Yeah.
when you were talking about the
Right,
dentist.
Denniston, that's right. See, we don't, in some of these, we don't have, some of the images, most of the images are either in my collection or came from maritime museums and so on, or from families who I've interviewed. I've done a lot of oral histories, lonely family photos and so on. In other cases, we kind of don't have photographs, so we have to kind of give of that period. So we kind of try to find representational photographs, and that's one of them I took a little liberty with, was just to sort of give a representation when there isn't anything in my archives or any other archive I can find. Any other question? Come on, I like
I
questions.
got one. I love questions. Okay, so, how can we find out about how the lighthouse got here? I mean, we know it was two options. I mean, is it common to not have any records of how it was transported and we'll just never know?
Yes, Janice, that's something that has always been very frustrating in doing this kind of work, because the period that I'm interested in, which is kind of what I call the historic period, about the 1840s to 1940s, I got to do a little more 1830s with the one at Point Pinos because of the early California history, but that's kind of the historical period. But what I found in doing much of that research is records are often non-existent. They are conflicting. If you're looking for Coast Guard records in particular for any period, they may not be in existence, they may be partial. I know there was a big fire at one point for some of the records for a certain period of time, and I've used the San Bruno archives. I mean, I've been everywhere looking at things, and you will sometimes just find pieces of it because there's no consistency. We've also traveled back east. I have a couple of favorite maritime museums back there. Mariners Museum in Newport News is wonderful. They have the largest collection of maritime material in the Western Hemisphere. We've been to Greenwich, England to look at that, their archives. I mean, we've been all over the place to do research. But in this country, when you're looking for those kinds of records and where did it come from, and as I recall, the researchers also had partial information. They had a piece that they found that just said, here's where it came from, but we don't know how it came here. Was it by sea, which was possible? Was it by train, which then would have been possible? Did they
Aliens.
take it apart, did they ship it in one
Aliens.
piece?
I heard a great
Found out
story.
anything else?
I had somebody visiting one day, and this is just one of those hearsay stories, but you think to yourself, why would a grandparent say this to a grandchild? His grandfather used to paint out here all the time, and he'd take his grandson with him, and this was the adult grandson telling you this story. And he said, and my grandfather used to always tell me, you know, that lighthouse has been around the Cape, which would indicate it came by ship, and somehow this guy knew about it, or at least he knew back then already that it had come from New England.
Well, and you never know. Sometimes that word of mouth is true. Sometimes
just
it's
legend.
the kid are making them up for the kids, or it may make a sense to him. To me, it makes sense.
Yeah, but the evidence was so thin, even linking it to there. I had years before seen an image of the Isle of Mott lighthouse up in Lake Champlain, and I said, that's our lighthouse. It's salmon colored, but that's our lighthouse. After this whole thing blew up, I researched and found 6 of them that were carbon copies made
Oh,
from
absolutely.
1879 to 1881,
Yeah.
all around New England. So
Yeah.
this was kind of and they often replaced lighthouses that were, like at Wellfleet, that replaced a lighthouse that was kind of sinking into the beach and
Exactly.
unhealthy.
And that was often the case. They
So-
would use a certain blueprint. That's happened out on this, on this.
And I was so fascinated by this fact that there were these 6 lighthouses. Where were they made? North of Boston, where's the foundry? Because they all had the same little Italianated column. I wrote the people who had done the discovery and never heard, they're just, to them it's just like, oh, well, it's just mass production of them.
Yeah.
Isn't that fascinating? I thought, that's cool.
Yeah, well, yes.
I heard Dave say one time that it's almost impossible to corroborate a story. You know, so often they're word of mouth that one person heard his grandfather. And,
Sometimes the best you can do, well, 2 things. First, one, it takes phenomenal amount of research and persistence, I will tell you that, to find the story. Sometimes you get very lucky, sometimes you really just have to put the time in. Each of my books is 2 to 3 years in the making because we do the legwork. And we found some places where they actually have real stuff, like even the state archives in Sacramento. If you want newspapers, early newspapers, that is the place to go. Libraries, other locations, they have pieces here, pieces there. May not be what you're looking for. Huge, huge archive. And they have a huge room, bigger than this, with all the machines. And my favorite thing is they have technicians who can help you if something goes wrong. And they're right there. So that is the biggest archive locally for, near us. I think it's one of the biggest ones if you want that. They also have and San Bruno archives too, but if you want to do the white glove stuff, they have a history room there too with some of the early materials. Same with San Bruno, some things they'll let you look at, others it's the white glove routine because they're so old and fragile. But it takes a lot of persistence, it takes a lot of effort, and it takes, I think, for me, it's the willingness to say, I'm not quite satisfied with that answer. And you keep asking questions, but sometimes you don't find a better answer. The best you can do is just list the resources that you found, and if it's a story, like we're talking anecdotally, so-and-so said, I did an interview with, and they said, is it possible? Or, you might get this story or that story, but like the story of Pigeon Point and how it was named and who named it, it could be one of 2 different things, but put them both out there. What's the real story? We may never know. So I think you can get at some good stories and some truths, but it's hard and it probably doesn't happen that often that you get the full story. I do agree with that.
and to connect the one end to the other.
Yeah.
Hardly ever is anybody going to say you're wrong.
You mean?
Yeah.
Oh, well, they do. Let me tell you about being a woman in the maritime history field. And I've been doing this for, I didn't have gray hair when I started, but I had to deal with a lot of old salts. I mean, serious, and it can be very difficult too, that they will call you out, or you will sometimes have out at the lighthouse where they're doing tours and stuff out there. Some people have well, no, that's not the right date, or that's not, or that winch goes that way, not that way, or, I mean, people all have their different interests, and so, they will do that. And maybe this crowd is too polite, but, you know, there are others who will, and I think the best way you can do that is, not be defensive about it, just say, oh, really, or where did you get that information, or can you help me understand, or I'd love to do more research on it, or whatever. I'm always open to that. If I miss the boat somewhere, I'm always happy to know that so I can follow that next track.
Maybe one more question.
Yes?
No, I was just gonna say that, you said that history is happening now or around us, if I remember, and one of, when I was at Modesto Junior College, which is where I went to school, they had a women's history class, and they only had one, so I took it 3 times, and what I pulled away from that, which was like stuck with me the most, was just that, you know, when we were just talking about corroboration and the things that you can't find the information for, is just to be recording our history, you know, now. And so like, there was like a questionnaire that was like 3 pages long or something, and I interviewed my grandmother, my aunt, my mother then. But it's just important because women's history, now we can finally challenge that, but we didn't exist for hundreds of years, and that our history wasn't important to record. But that's the same for anybody right now. We should just, if history is happening now, take the time to write your own story, especially in our communities like this where, I mean, 100 years from now, what we're doing right now will be history about happening.
You know, that's an excellent point, and that's something that we've had a lot of discussions about, and that's why I feel so privileged to be able to do what we do. Because it is a snapshot in time. We're lucky enough, and each book actually was researched slightly differently depending on what was available when and where it was going and so on. And also that so many people, after they've seen this or had a present, will come to you and say, I have a story, or I'm part of a family which, and we went, darn, I wish I'd had that. Well, maybe at some point in time we can use that. And so we keep building on it. I absolutely agree with that. And quick reference to the women in history. One of the things I strive to do is make sure women are reflected in these books.
I know.
And yes, and because we were there, we are there, there were many different roles. You know, I've done a presentation about women in maritime history and kind of tracing it from the early days, and women were pirates, you know, on through being lighthouse keepers, being ship captains, being navigators on major vessels, and all kinds of things, so we're able to do that. And I had a lot of fun and a lot of interest doing that presentation because that was another side that we often don't think about, but now we're beginning to be able to say, here's more of that story. And that's true with, it was like Portuguese shore whaling. I did a lot of research on that, and I just gave you little snippets today, but some real fascinating books about that with real names and dates and people who were part of this. And that's another segment, you know, the Portuguese doing that particular thing for any aspect. It's just kind of fascinating to keep building on our history. And Lo, did you have a question?
Oh, I did actually have a question and a comment. First, I guess I'll start with my comment, if you don't mind, because I think, and I'm gonna just like join you up front for a second. JoAnn just gave you guys some really great docenting advice that I hope everybody heard. You were talking about how you've been places and you've had people get a little, remember the word you used, I'm gonna say surly, and try and go, well, that's not the date, and I was always told, and and the way that she just expressed handling it is, I think, really valuable information for you guys who are going to be the face of the museum. You will get people that are convinced. Dave and I have this running joke about the illustrious pencil factory in Half Moon Bay, which didn't exist. That's not a real thing. But you might get somebody like Dave who's like, there was this pencil factory in Half Moon Bay, and it was and it's important to just, oh, I didn't know that. Fascinating.
history, and you're not there to police people and some of their crazy ideas. So I just wanted to thank you, JoAnn, for a little bit of insight on docentine. You can always say, shucks, I don't know. I'll look it up. Tell me more about it.
Give me your contact information and I'll give you.
Exactly. So
Sometimes it will actually be real historical.
much like the illustrious pencil factory of Half Moon Bay. Something I'm just gonna find into. Anyway, so that I did right. I just want to say thank you, JoAnn. I think that's really valuable stuff for you guys. But my question, and I'll go back to being an audience member, is I realize it probably changed boat to boat, but like with some of these shipwrecks, how many people are we talking about being rescued or coming ashore?
It really depended on some of the larger shipwrecks. You know, it maybe 75 out of 150 died, you know, or maybe 150 died and 3 were rescued. And on the smaller vessels, it really depended on a fishing vessel. There might be 5 people on a little vessel and there might be 11. It just depended on the vessel, where it came from, what the cargo was, what its purpose was.
Close to shore.
Close to shore. And that was a key issue.
At night, was it day?
Mhm.
Could they find shore?
And one of the things during the period too was, of course, aside from the obvious technological advances we have today, was that Julie mentioned this. You know, the tendency was to hug the shoreline more because you could see, you could hear the fog signal better, you could see after they were built, of course, the lighthouses better. You could see the shoreline to some degree to follow it, and so there was a tendency to sail further in than there is today. You know, now you're way out there. And so that is one of the reasons why there were so many shipwrecks, you know, aside from the current, the fog, human error, you know, just fickle weather and fickle people. I mean, we have stories that are true of drunken captains, you know, or the third mate who's on deck and not paying attention. And you know, seriously, people ask me, you know, are you ever going to write fiction? I don't have to. These stories are amazing and they're true. So lots of different reasons for that.
What about that Italian guy who wanted to wave to his girlfriend?
And yeah, there you go.
Look what happened.
Look what happened. The ship went down.
We're still having shipwrecks, they're smaller, I mean, we had
Yeah,
fishing
they're
boat go
still-
ashore, we had
Yeah,
sailboats,
mostly-
another sailboat in Pacifica.
Just last
We have a
night,
lot
there
of-
was a police boat out here, I mean, there was red lights with searchlights doing something that was way off, so I
We have
wonder what that's
a lot of mostly fishing boats and pleasure boats, but a lot of fishing boats go down out here because they go out in dangerous weather. They, you know, they're close to shore. They're against these, you know, sometimes I think they go out and don't really think that it's going to be dangerous, but it is. But mostly fishing vessels. When my first book came out in November, 2007, and it's had several more publications, whatever, but we had a big celebration at the lighthouse in November, and just the night before, literally, that we were going to do this celebration, there was a shipwreck out there, and it was a fishing boat. And so we went down and got pictures. But the fact that it happened right then, and we were inviting all these people in, officials, but also people who were family members, and some who even had folks who were on ships that went down, and I've interviewed some of those people too. And it's just amazing. So it just reiterated that, yeah, and that's all kind of part of the future history probably, if anybody's going to be looking into it. But it's dangerous out there. It's dangerous work.
Wind up, so that if anybody's interested in buying a book,
Yes.
there's an opportunity, because I understand we have to be out of here by 3.
Yeah, pretty good. Pretty
So,
okay.
yeah. So, thank you. Yeah.
And Julie, one more round of applause for our hosts here at the Lighthouse.